On the 5th of May, 1945, Gauleiter Karl Hanke boarded a light Fiesler Storch aircraft on a narrow strip of land in the middle of a dead city. The Führer had been dead for 5 days. Berlin had fallen 3 days earlier. Radio communication with the rest of the Reich was almost non-functional. But Hanke knew one thing for certain. There was an aircraft for him, but not for those who remained below. The strip from which he took off had, just 3 months prior, been the main street of Breslau, lined with apartment buildings, shops, and insurance company offices. It had been cleared by hand, under artillery fire, by civilian residents and elderly men from the Volkssturm, the people's militia units that conscripted those no longer fit for the regular army. Below, among the ruins, the garrison still held its defense, a garrison that would lay down its arms the next day. Below, people were still dying, for a city that had long since lost any military significance for the command. The question is different. Why did one man in this city receive a personal ticket out, while tens of thousands of others received only the order to stand to the end? We will return to the final days of Breslau's defense a little later, because before understanding what the capitulation looked like, one must understand what the city was like before it was turned into a fortress, and who exactly turned it into a fortress. Before the war, Breslau was the 4th largest city in Germany, a major industrial, commercial, and university center of Silesia, with a population of about 630,000 people. Gothic cathedrals, a 15th century town hall, one of the oldest universities in Central Europe, a bustling river port on the Oder. The city gave the impression of such a solid and well-established place that until the very end of 1944, many of its inhabitants sincerely did not believe the war could reach their doorstep. There was even a persistent propaganda myth that Breslau had allegedly never been taken by storm in its history, a myth that the city administration actively exploited to maintain morale on the eve of the siege. In the autumn of 1944, Adolf Hitler signed a directive to create a network of so-called fortresses, cities that were to be held at any cost, even in complete encirclement, without any connection to the main forces. The logic was extremely simple and simultaneously extremely cynical. If Soviet troops became bogged down in protracted battles for fortified cities, the pace of their advance would slow, and the front line in other sectors would gain precious time. The bet was not on victory, but on delaying defeat, at the cost of cities that were doomed to destruction in advance. It is also worth understanding what kind of city Breslau was for the Nazi Party itself long before any siege. Even in the elections of 1933, about 200,000 residents here voted for Hitler's party, one of the highest levels of support among major German cities. And from that moment on, the Nazis consistently consolidated control over the city, launching a campaign of terror against Jews and all dissenters. On the 9th of November, 1938, during the night of the nationwide pogrom, Breslau's synagogues were burned to the ground, and the guillotine in the prison on Kleczkow Street operated non-stop, with the beheaded bodies of executed political prisoners handed over to the medical faculties of the city's university for anatomical needs. It was precisely this reputation as an exemplary, ideologically reliable city that became one of the reasons why Hitler deemed it possible to turn Breslau into a symbol of unyielding steadfastness, and not at all due to any special military advantages of its location. Almost until the very end of the war, Breslau remained a kind of quiet harbor for the Germans. The city was out of reach of Allied aircraft. It was not affected by the massive carpet bombings that struck Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden, and it was first attacked from the air only in October 1944. Because of this, the city's population had not decreased by that time, but, on the contrary, had swollen to almost 1 million people due to refugees from the East seeking relative safety here, meaning a significant portion of those who were to perish under Soviet shells and in the March cold of evacuation ended up in Breslau precisely because they had fled here from the war, not towards it. In August 1944, Breslau officially received fortress status. Hitler personally appointed Gauleiter Karl Hanke, the regional party leader of Lower Silesia, as the so-called combat commandant of the city, endowing him with almost unlimited powers and placing him above the regular military commanders. It was this decision, made half a year before the siege began that determined the entire subsequent logic of terror. The city received not a professional military officer at the head of its defense, but a fanatical party functionary for whom indicators of ideological steadfastness meant more than military expediency. To understand the nature of the terror that befell Breslau, one must understand who this man was. Hanke began his career as the personal secretary and trusted assistant to propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, was a guest in his family and, according to contemporaries, was in a close relationship with the minister's wife, Magda Goebbels, which nearly cost him his career but, contrary to expectations, only strengthened his position in the party hierarchy thanks to Hitler's personal patronage. In 1941, Hanke was appointed Gauleiter of Lower Silesia, a regional party leader with almost unlimited local power, displacing his predecessor from the post, who was considered an insufficiently harsh enforcer of the party line. Even then, several years before the siege, Hanke gained a reputation as an administrator for whom indicators of loyalty and discipline meant more than human lives. It was under him that the network of forced labor in Lower Silesia actively expanded, including a system of camps connected to the Gross Rosen concentration camp, where prisoners were sent to quarry granite and work in military enterprises. It is also telling that in the final weeks of the Reich's existence, on the 29th of April, 1945, while in besieged Breslau, Hanke learned that Hitler had personally appointed him as Heinrich Himmler's successor to the posts of Reichsführer SS and Chief of German Police, an appointment that remained purely symbolic, because a few days later the Reich, which he was theoretically supposed to lead, physically ceased to exist. The ideal defense plan for Breslau on paper looked logical. The city turns into a fortified strongpoint, every district into a stronghold with all-round defense. The civilian population is partially evacuated, partially involved in building defensive structures, and the garrison holds its positions until the arrival of relieving Wehrmacht forces from the west. On staff maps, Breslau was drawn with rings of fortifications, lines of anti-tank ditches, and symbols for artillery positions and reserve battalions. No one in these calculations accounted for one detail. By the beginning of 1945, the Reich physically no longer possessed any relief forces capable of breaking through the ring of Soviet armies. The German Eastern Front in Silesia was rapidly disintegrating under the blows of the Vistula-Oder operation during those weeks, and any reserves theoretically capable of coming to the aid of Breslau were being absorbed on other, far more critical sectors of the front long before they could have reached it. The first military commandant of the fortress, even before the declaration of a full siege, was General Kraus, but he was almost immediately incapacitated due to severe pneumonia. On the 2nd of February 1945 at 10:20 in the morning, he was succeeded in this post by Major General Hans von Alphen, personally selected by the commander of Army Group Center, Colonel General Ferdinand Schorner. Von Alphen was a career staff officer who soberly assessed the situation and insisted on a timely, organized evacuation of the civilian population, while there was still time and transport available. But it was precisely this sobriety that became the reason why, just over a month later, at the direct instigation of Hanke and with the sanction of the same Schorner, von Alphen was removed. On the 6th of March, 1945, General Hermann Niehoff landed at the Gandau airfield on the outskirts of the city, appointed as the new fortress commandant, and on the 8th of March, he officially assumed command. Von Alphen left the city by plane 2 days later, one of the last to fly out of Breslau before it became practically impossible. As early as the 15th of September 1944, long before Soviet troops appeared under the city walls, Hanke addressed the residents in the Century Halle and demanded the introduction of a 10-hour working day to accelerate the construction of fortifications. From that moment on, practically the entire able-bodied population of the city, including women and adolescents, was mobilized for the construction of defensive structures. Around Breslau, at a distance of 40 to 60 kilometers, the construction of external defensive lines with the conditional names Hubertus, D1 and D2 began, intended to prevent direct artillery shelling of the city itself, lines which ultimately did not withstand even a few days of fighting in February when the Soviet offensive truly began.
The fortress commandant's headquarters was located in the casemates of the Taschen bastion, and field hospitals were set up in the basements of the main railway station and under Stegauer Platz, the same place where the main army stocks of ammunition and food were stored. According to garrison documents, there was no shortage of food in the first weeks of the siege, whereas artillery shells, especially of large caliber, were catastrophically lacking almost from the very beginning. By February 1945, the Reich's rear depots simply could not simultaneously supply dozens of such isolated fortresses across the collapsing Eastern Front. The blind spot of the entire defense plan was precisely that real power in the city from the very beginning lay in the hands of a man without military education, for whom any talk of retreat or evacuation was tantamount to treason. Hanke considered such talk defeatist and demanded that the city be held at any cost, down to the last person, fully assuming both military and civilian powers, regardless of who was formally listed as the fortress commandant. An evacuation did begin, but not according to plan, rather in panic, when Soviet tank wedges were already approaching the city. On the 19th of January 1945, tens of thousands of women, elderly, and children were literally driven from their homes into the snowy fields of Silesia at a temperature of around -20 degrees. There were almost no organized columns. People were given a few hours to gather. Warm clothing, food, and transport were catastrophically lacking. The roads were icy, and sled and horse-drawn transport quickly broke down. Historians call this episode the Breslau Death March.
According to various estimates, thousands of civilians perished in this winter exodus from cold, exhaustion, and shelling on the roads. The exact number remains a subject of debate to this day because archival documents from that period are fragmentary, and many testimonies survived only in private post-war memoirs. But even by the most cautious estimates, we are talking about several thousand deaths that could have been avoided if the evacuation had begun several weeks earlier, as initially proposed by General von Alphen, who was removed precisely for that proposal. On the 13th of February 1945, units of the 6th Army of the First Ukrainian Front, under the overall command of Marshal Ivan Konev, with the forces of the 22nd and 74th Rifle Corps, supported by the 77th Fortified Region, closed the encirclement ring around Breslau, and the next day it was completely sealed. By this time, between 80 and 100,000 civilian residents remained in the city. Those who did not manage, could not, or did not want to leave, and a garrison which, according to various estimates, numbered between 55 and 57,000 men. Its core consisted of the recently formed 609th Infantry Division, separate units of the 269th Infantry Division, an improvised SS regiment named Breslau, formed, according to historians, primarily from former concentration camp guards who fought with grim, desperate resolve, perfectly understanding the fate awaiting them if captured. School and reserve units, police battalions, Luftwaffe ground personnel units, remnants of shattered combat formations, and finally, 38 Volkssturm battalions, approximately 15,000 men, of which only 26 battalions were considered combat-ready, while the rest were construction or reserve battalions, with each battalion averaging about 400 men, often with no combat training at all, and armed with captured or obsolete weapons dating back to the First World War. Even at the end of January, before the ring was fully closed, a separate Hitler Youth Regiment, transferred specifically to reinforce the defense, managed to arrive in the city. In essence, this amounted to the organized dispatch of adolescents to certain death under the guise of a military unit. Later, already in February, the garrison was reinforced by the airlifted 25th Parachute Jaeger Regiment from the 9th Parachute Division, one of the few truly combat-ready reinforcements the city received throughout the entire siege. Artillery support for the garrison was a motley mix of 32 batteries, equipped with both German guns and captured Soviet, Polish, Yugoslav, and Italian systems, which created constant problems with the supply of ammunition of different calibers. There were no tanks in the garrison at all, save for a company of 15 assault guns. As a substitute for tanks, in January, 50 light remote-controlled demolition vehicles Goliath were delivered to the city, along with 2 batteries of 75mm anti-tank guns and 18 anti-aircraft guns of 88mm caliber, which the Germans, as on many other sectors of the front, used primarily against ground targets rather than aircraft. Supplying the besieged garrison fell almost entirely on the Luftwaffe. Over the course of 76 days, up until the 1st of May, German transport aviation carried out over 2,000 sorties, delivering more than 1,500 tons of cargo to the city, ammunition, medical supplies, and food.
The price of these deliveries was enormous. A significant portion of the transport and medical evacuation aircraft attempting to land on shell-pocked runways were shot down by Soviet anti-aircraft artillery and fighters, and with them perished the severely wounded officers who were being evacuated on those same flights. From the moment the encirclement was closed begins the true price of stubbornness, which the city would pay for almost 3 months. The first Soviet assault, launched almost immediately after the encirclement, showed the command of the First Ukrainian Front that taking the dense urban development on the move would not be possible. The attacking units suffered heavy losses on streets swept by fire from every window and basement. On the 22nd of February, units of the 6th Army occupied 3 southern suburbs of Breslau, and by the next day, they had reached the southern outskirts of the city itself. By the end of February, the Soviet command had completely abandoned frontal assaults in favor of a methodical tactic of gradually squeezing out the garrison. Heavy artillery was brought into the city, including guns of 152 and 203mm caliber, which were rolled into direct fire positions and sequentially smashed building after building before assault groups of infantry and sappers went into action. This tactic was slow but inexorable. It reduced the defenders' advantage in dense urban terrain almost to zero because a building ceased to be a shelter after several accurate hits from a large caliber. Sappers cleared paths for assault groups, not through fire-swept streets, but through breaches in the walls of adjacent buildings, a method perfected during the Battle of Stalingrad and brought here almost to automatism. The Soviet command consciously avoided massive tank attacks in the urban area, preferring the methodical destruction of buildings by fire, a lesson well learned after the street fighting in Stalingrad, and later confirmed by the bitter experience of the assault on Budapest. One of the bloodiest sectors of the defense became the area of the park on the hill, which the Germans called Liebigshöhe, a dominant height in the southern part of the city, which changed hands several times during March. According to accounts recorded in the post-war memoirs of surviving garrison officers, the fight for control of this patch of land was literally for every tree and shell crater, and losses on both sides here numbered in the hundreds within just a few days. No less fierce fighting unfolded in early March around Bernhardin, Tarnogay, Herder, Elazna, and Sudetska streets, as well as around the University Quarter and the Tower of St. Elizabeth's Church, which the German garrison used as an observation post for fire correction. The tower commanded a significant portion of the city center, and Soviet artillery methodically destroyed its upper levels over several weeks before finally putting the observation post out of action. The defense of St. Charles Borromeo Church in those same first weeks of March deserves special mention. The garrison of the church consisted of only 40 men, armed with 2 heavy and 4 light machine guns and Panzerfausts, and yet every attempt by the 1st Battalion of one of the Soviet rifle regiments to capture the building ended in failure, until the Soviet command ultimately solved the problem not with an infantry assault, but with direct fire from heavy guns at the church building itself. A similar picture repeated itself throughout the city in those weeks. Teenagers from the Hitler Youth, armed only with Panzerfausts, according to German data, disabled 76 units of Soviet armored vehicles in one 3-day period of fighting in early March, turning every fire-swept street into a deadly trap for advancing tanks. And this same tactic, at the cost of their own lives, repeatedly postponed the inevitable by just a few days. Parallel to the fighting at the front, Hanke imposed a regime of terror in the rear, unparalleled in other besieged German cities of that period of the war. On his direct orders, military tribunals were created, which shot and hanged people merely on suspicion of defeatist sentiments.
Public executions were carried out in squares, and the bodies were left hanging from lampposts with placards on their chests, inscribed stating that the executed was a coward or had refused to defend the homeland.
Well-documented cases exist where soldiers were executed for abandoning their positions under fire without orders, and cases of reprisals against civilians for harboring deserters or possessing a white cloth, which could be interpreted as readiness to surrender. Historian Richard Hargreaves, who dedicated a separate monograph to the siege of Breslau, cites dozens of such episodes based on post-war testimonies of surviving officers and surviving fragments of the German garrison's combat journal. By some estimates, in just the first weeks of the siege, the number executed by the sentences of these courts numbered several hundred people, with some executions carried out without any trial at all, on the personal oral order of the Gauleiter. Against the backdrop of this terror, the episode with the construction of a new runway is particularly telling, and is still considered one of the most absurd decisions of the entire siege. The city needed an airfield for communication with the outside world, for supplying ammunition and evacuating severely wounded officers. The existing civilian airfield, Gandau, on the outskirts, found itself in an area of intense Soviet bombardment and became practically unusable for regular flights. Then, Hanke ordered a new runway to be built right in the city center, on the site of one of the main thoroughfares, Kaiserstrasse, a wide street lined with 19th-century tenement houses. Work began in the final days of February and continued throughout March. Thousands of civilians, primarily women, the elderly, and teenagers, along with Volkssturm battalions and groups of foreign forced laborers, manually dismantled and demolished entire residential quarters using picks, shovels, and bare hands, without any heavy machinery. They had to work under constant artillery and sniper fire, often at night under the light of searchlights, which themselves became targets for Soviet-adjusted fire. According to historians' estimates, clearing the strip laid between the Shitnitsky Bridge and the Grunwaldzki Bridge required the destruction of between 2,000 and 3,000 buildings, including part of the university library, several churches, and a large department store in the very center of the city. Despite the fact that the strip itself was used only sporadically throughout the siege, for several dozen flights of light transport and liaison aircraft, and never had a decisive influence on the outcome of the fighting. Bread and food rations for this work were issued only to those who actually labored on the clearance, meaning even hunger was turned into a tool of coercion. The people working there were under direct fire from Soviet artillery, which methodically shelled the construction site, aware of its purpose, and according to some historical estimates, the number of those killed directly at this construction site reached 13,000 people. 13,000 lives for a strip of land that never once turned the tide of battle on any sector of the front throughout the entire siege. Its only truly regular passenger in the end became Hanke himself, who flew out from it on the 5th of May, one day before the general capitulation of the garrison. The pastor of one of the city's parishes, Father Paul Peikert, kept a diary during those weeks, surviving fragments of which later became one of the key sources for historians. He described how hurricane-force winds scattered clouds of sparks through the districts, and how fire engulfed entire houses from basement to roof, turning them into gigantic furnaces. One of the garrison's junior sergeants, whose letters also survived in the archives, confessed to his family that he felt like a rat driven into a trap, awaiting an inevitable end, and that he had long lost all hope of escaping this hell alive. Meanwhile, according to the testimony of architect Albert Speer, to whom Hanke personally stated this even before the siege began, the Gauleiter preferred to see the city burned to the ground rather than surrendered without a fight, and he precisely kept this grim oath right up to his own flight. By the end of March, the German garrison controlled less than half of the city's original territory, squeezed into several isolated districts along the river. On the 31st of March, the city was shelled by heavy artillery simultaneously from the north, south, and west, and according to the testimonies of officers in the advancing units of the 6th Army, a significant portion of the city's buildings were already engulfed in fires by this point, which no one attempted to extinguish because there simply remained neither the strength nor water in the damaged water supply. Hospitals were overflowing, medications and bandages were catastrophically lacking,
Outbreaks of typhus and dysentery began among the civilian population, sheltering in basements without light, water, or proper nutrition. On the 1st of April, the Soviet command unleashed a bombardment of unprecedented scale upon the city. 340 bombers for 9 consecutive hours methodically pounded artillery positions, the front line of defense, and all key landmarks of the urban landscape. On the same day, infantry finally captured the Gandau airfield, the last site outside the city still used by German aviation, and from that moment, the improvised strip on the site of Kaiserstrasse in the center of Breslau remained for the garrison the only, though almost useless, thread of connection with the outside world. To the north of the city during those same weeks stood units of the 2nd Polish Army under the command of General Karol Świerczewski, ready to join the assault. But after the successful April offensive of the Soviet troops, they were ultimately redeployed to another sector of the front, never directly engaged in the battles for Breslau. The April battles came at an especially high cost to the Red Army precisely because the German defense by this point had become both extremely fanatical and extremely inventive. On the 18th of April, supporting the offensive of the 112th Rifle Division, the 374th Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment lost 13 heavy self-propelled guns, ISU 152, within a single day of fighting for just a few blocks. According to some estimates, the daily mortality rate of the civilian population from hunger and exhaustion in these final weeks of the siege reached 80 people per day, while the formal fortress command during those same days continued to report upward on the unyielding steadfastness of the garrison. On the 20th of April, on Hitler's 56th birthday, General Niehoff ordered chocolate bars to be distributed to the garrison soldiers, a small, festive gesture amidst hunger, typhus, and unceasing shelling. This episode, documented in German sources of the period, better than any declarations shows how detached from reality the formal fortress command had become by that moment. People were dying from blood poisoning in basements without light, while those above still considered it appropriate to celebrate the birthday of a man who in 10 days would shoot himself in a Berlin bunker, never having given an order that could have saved even one of those lives.
On the 4th of May, when the fall of Berlin was already an accomplished fact, a delegation of local clergy, Pastor Hornig, Dr. Konrad, Bishop Ferche, and Canon Kramer, approached General Niehoff with a direct demand to capitulate immediately and cease the senseless bloodshed. Niehoff gave no definite answer and essentially sent the delegation away empty-handed. On the same day, Pastor Hornig repeated his demand publicly, addressing directly the commanders of the garrison units. When Hanke learned of this negotiation attempt, he categorically forbade Niehoff from having any dealings with the clergy on this matter, while the Gauleiter himself at that moment was actively preparing for his own flight from the city. Simultaneously, German communist underground fighters distributed leaflets in the city titled "Freedom Fighters," calling for an end to resistance and directly appealing to residents not to believe official propaganda any longer. The Soviet side, however, attempted to break this fanatical doctrine by other means, not only with the fire of heavy guns. Even in early May, a sabotage group formed by the National Committee for a Free Germany, an organization uniting captured German officers and soldiers who had switched to the anti-Hitler movement, was secretly infiltrated into the city. Approximately 80 men, disguised in Wehrmacht uniforms and posing as soldiers separated from their units, were to infiltrate the German garrison's position, disarm the posts, and persuade the remaining defenders to lay down their arms without further bloodshed. The group initially managed to surprise several guards and even eliminate some SS commanders, but the operation ultimately failed. A fierce battle ensued, in which both the saboteurs and the German soldiers defending their positions perished. On the 5th of May, the same day Hanke was preparing to flee, Lieutenant Horst Veit, who led the group, died in this battle, a man who, until the last hour of his life, tried to save the city not by force of arms, but by force of persuasion, and did not succeed where, just a day later, Hitler's own death would succeed. The breach of this doctrine came not from within the German command, but from a change that occurred far from Breslau, in Berlin. On the 30th of April, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in the Reich Chancellery. On the 2nd of May, the Berlin garrison capitulated, the formal order for which Hanke demanded that Breslau be held to the last man, the personal order of the Führer, physically ceased to exist along with the man who issued it. But communication with the rest of the Reich was so poor and the machinery of terror so inertial that the fighting in Breslau continued for several more days after the fall of Berlin, and most of the garrison simply had no reliable information about what was happening beyond the encirclement ring. General Niehoff, finally receiving reliable, albeit delayed, information about Hitler's death and Berlin's capitulation through surviving communication channels, began seeking ways to negotiate with the Soviet command, no longer asking for the Gauleiter's permission, who by that time had practically withdrawn from the daily leadership of the defense, focusing on preparing his own evacuation. On the 5th of May, Hanke flew out of the city on that very Fieseler Storch aircraft, which had originally been held in reserve for the evacuation of General Niehoff, not for the Gauleiter. He headed toward Prague, hoping to break through further west to American positions. His subsequent fate long remained a subject of rumors, but according to the version most confirmed by modern historians, approximately a month later, already after Germany's surrender, Hanke attempted to escape from a column of German prisoners of war, disguised in the uniform of an SS private, and was identified and killed by Czech partisans during the escape attempt. The body was never officially identified. The man who ordered a city quarter demolished for his own path to salvation ultimately perished as a nameless fugitive, trying one last time to flee from his own past. On the 6th of May, 1945, at 6:30 in the evening, in the Villa Colonia mansion on Kaiser Friedrichstrasse, General Niehoff signed the act of surrender of the Breslau garrison to the commander of the 6th Soviet Army, General Vladimir Gluzdovsky. The surrender terms provided certain guarantees for prisoners and the civilian population, although subsequently, according to German accounts, a significant portion of these conditions were not upheld in practice. The surrender of Breslau occurred 2 days before the general unconditional surrender of Germany, signed in Reims and Karlshorst. The city held out for 82 days, and the last of them were battles for a fortress whose fate was decided not in Breslau, but in Berlin, something the garrison itself learned with a delay of several days. For Niehoff himself, the stubbornness of the Gauleiter, to whom he formally reported, ultimately cost 10 years. As a prisoner of war, he was sent to a Soviet camp and returned to his homeland only in 1955, whereas Hanke, who issued the cruelest orders, did not even live to see the end of that summer in which the war ended. The human dimension of this story is visible not in headquarters reports, but in private diaries and post-war memoirs of residents. Historians Norman Davies and Roger Morehouse, in a book dedicated to the city's history, provide accounts of how neighbors were taken away for one careless remark about the futility of further resistance, and how families hid their sons' age or physical condition for weeks to protect them from conscription into the Volkssturm and almost certain death on the barricades. Teenagers from Hitler Youth units, 14 or 15 years old, received handheld anti-tank grenade launchers and were sent against Soviet tanks with the same formal seriousness as career soldiers sent to the front lines. The wounded in overcrowded basement hospitals died not so much from the wounds themselves as from blood poisoning and gangrene, because antiseptics and bandages had been in short supply since early March, and surgeons operated by the light of kerosene lamps because electricity in most districts had been cut off since February. A separate and almost unheard theme in official German reports of the time is the fate of foreign forced laborers, brought in to build fortifications and clear debris on Kaiserstrasse. These people, taken to Silesia from occupied territories in Eastern Europe, were in a worse position than German civilians. They were used in the most dangerous work areas under open fire. Their deaths were almost never specifically recorded in official German documents, and declassified post-war materials allow historians only to roughly reconstruct the scale of these losses from scattered testimonies of survivors. Let us isolate one number to physically grasp the scale of this stubbornness. Of the 30,000 buildings in pre-war Breslau, 21,600 were completely destroyed by the time of surrender. 21,600 out of 30,000. After the surrender, only about 1/3 of the pre-war housing stock remained suitable for normal life in the city,
And an official intelligence report of the First Ukrainian Front, compiled after the city's occupation, described Breslau's central districts as a continuous strip of burnt-out ruins, where even experienced sappers initially found it difficult to navigate using pre-war maps because familiar streets and landmarks simply no longer existed. Exactly how many people paid for these 82 days has still not been definitively established, and this is a separate lesson for those who seek only round, convenient numbers in history.
Modern historians estimate German military losses of the garrison at around 6,000 killed, while the number of wounded is cited as much larger, from 23 to 33,000 people according to various estimates. Soviet losses of the Sixth Army during the siege are estimated even less definitively, from several thousand according to some archival loss reports to several tens of thousands according to other later estimates, which include not only the killed but also the wounded and those who fell ill during the long weeks of positional fighting in the destroyed city. The number of civilian casualties remains a subject of intense historiographical debate. Some sources cite figures of several thousand people, while others are an order of magnitude higher. And the very fact of this discrepancy eloquently speaks to how poorly the accounting of human lives was kept in a city governed by a man who considered talk of evacuation to be treason. After the surrender, the fate of the city itself proved no less dramatic than that of its defenders.
As a result of the Potsdam Conference in the summer of that same year, Silesia was transferred to Poland. The German name Breslau was changed to the Polish Wrocław, and nearly all the remaining German population of the city was forcibly expelled westward in the subsequent months and years, replaced by settlers, including Poles who were in turn deported from the eastern territories that had passed to the Soviet Union. The city, which Hanke had demanded be held as an inherently German fortress, ceased to be a German city altogether within mere months after the surrender. And this is perhaps the bitterest outcome of the entire story from the perspective of those very ideological tenets for which all the described sacrifices were made.
Already on the 9th of May, just 3 days after the surrender, the first Polish civilian delegation entered the ruined city, and soon after that began a systematic campaign to turn Breslau into Wrocław, with the renaming of streets, the removal of German signs and monuments, and the gradual displacement of the entire cultural layer that the city had accumulated over centuries. For decades after the war, the history of the siege remained a subject of restrained, almost reluctant conversation on both sides of the new border. For the German side, it was a reminder of the price of Nazi fanaticism. For the Polish side, it was an episode tightly interwoven with the painful question of their own post-war deportations from the territories that had passed eastward to the Soviet Union. Only many decades later, already in a united Europe, did the city begin to openly integrate this chapter of its history into museum exhibitions and memorials, acknowledging both the tragedy of the civilians and the direct responsibility of the Nazi leadership for making this tragedy possible in the first place. To appreciate how ultimately senseless this entire sacrifice was from a purely military standpoint, it is useful to look at a map of the entire Eastern Front from those weeks. Breslau was far from the only city granted fortress status in the final months of the war. A similar fate befell Königsberg in East Prussia, which fell on the 9th of April, 1945, after a week of fierce assaults. Poznan, where the German garrison held out in the citadel until the 23rd of February of that same year, and the Hungarian Budapest, which surrendered on the 13th of February, the very day the encirclement ring closed around Breslau. Each of these cities was intended, according to the German command's plan, to tie down significant forces of the Red Army, and thereby buy time for regrouping on other sectors of the front. In practice, however, while the 6th Soviet Army week after week methodically ground down the districts of Breslau, the main forces of the same First Ukrainian Front under the command of Konev advanced westward for many hundreds of kilometers, reached the Neisse River, and took direct part in the assault on Berlin itself. In other words, the sacrifice of Breslau gained practically nothing for the Reich. It merely meant that several Soviet divisions were occupied not on the main axis, but at the walls of one Silesian city. And even without this diversion, by the spring of 1945, Germany simply had no resources left to use any gained time in any meaningful way. Genius was not needed in this story.
Nor was heroism in its usual cinematic sense, only the stubbornness of one party functionary, willing to demolish residential blocks for a runway for his own salvation, and the readiness of a well-oiled machine of terror to carry out this order until the last day, even when the front line and the rest of the Reich had physically ceased to exist. The method of the victors here was also extremely simple and devoid of any heroic pathos. Methodical fire from heavy guns onto the districts until it no longer mattered what exactly the people remaining in the ruins were defending or in whose name they were doing it. The fortress that could not be surrendered under any circumstances held out 2 days longer than the country that had given the order. The Gauleiter, for whom the city was being demolished, flew out first, traveling light, with the clear conscience of a man who had fulfilled his party duty, and vanished into the chaos of the war's final days as tracelessly as the names of the thousands he left below vanished beneath the rubble. Those who remained in the city learned of the war's end last, already amidst the ruins they themselves had built in the final weeks, dismantling their own homes brick by brick for a runway that was never destined to save either the city or those who remained in it.